listening to Awake in Relationship, a podcast about intimacy, community, and culture in a time of great change, with Silas Rose.
Hello, my name is Silas Rose, and you are tuned into Awake in Relationship. So we're pretty close to 1 year out from the beginning of the pandemic, and we can start to see the end is in sight. However, many experts are warning about another epidemic on the horizon, and this one's around mental health. Let's face it, it's been a really tough year for many of us, and even before COVID, 1 in 4 adults have reported suffering from some form of mental affliction, be that depression, anxiety, ADHD, or PTSD. While there's many effective and safe treatments within the health system, there really hasn't been any great breakthroughs since the 1980s, when selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or otherwise known as SSRIs, came on the market. Well, all that's about to change with psychedelic therapy going mainstream. Psychedelics have been around for a long time, really since the dawn of time, and they played an important, albeit controversial, role in many forms of healing, and on a bigger picture, have been central in terms of transforming societal norms and reconnecting human consciousness to the greater web of life. So it's an exciting time for this emerging new field of psychedelic therapy, and I thought I'd invite on a guest, a personal friend, Jim Kragtwyk, who's a clinical counselor and addiction specialist, to talk about the origins, taboos, and potential of psychedelic therapy for healing many intractable conditions of the mind, but also a spiritually disconnected society. One of the great takeaways of this conversation for me personally is context is everything when it comes to taking psychedelics. And what makes psychedelic therapy so powerful is really the loving container created by the therapists and the unconditional support to guide not only through the experience itself, but to help unpack and integrate those experiences. So I just want to insert a standard disclaimer here that neither Jim or I are advocating using psychedelics as a form of self-medicating a serious mental health condition. And if you are going through a really hard time right now, I just strongly encourage you to please reach out to friends, family, and particularly professionals. Well, Jim, good morning, and welcome to Awake in Relationship.
Thank you for inviting me, Silas.
So we're coming up on, I think it's a year since we've been kind of in this bardo, which we call COVID. How has it been for you? And I imagine as a therapist, it's a really busy time.
It certainly is. Probably within a couple of months after COVID restrictions came into full effect around March last year, there was an extreme uptick. People reaching out for individual services, but also in the training world that I do, a tsunami of COVID stress, COVID anxiety, COVID resiliency webinar requests, and it just has been relentless for about a year. So yeah, huge impact.
And what's been making a difference for you personally to kind of get through this?
Well, I've been very fortunate to cultivate some fairly consistent and strong self-care patterns over the last few decades. And even though it's been quite challenging to connect socially, I also have a very strong social connection and community. Just finding creative and healthy and safe ways to engage with people. And, one of the things I might talk a little bit more about in our conversation is the actual medicine of positive, healthy relationships and how that links to the topic of psychedelics that we're going to be speaking about. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, that'd be awesome. And because you have a very kind of diverse background, and I know you through a number of different kind of tribes, as it were.
Yeah.
And so we'll get into that. And You've been a counselor for, I don't know, how many years, Jim? Like 10 years or more?
Oh my. Well, I've been a professional helper and a counselor since I was 19 years old. So it's more like 35 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And my first foray was working as a youth counselor in an open custody treatment facility. And yeah, 35 years later, now registered clinical counselor, psychotherapist, certified addictions counselor, and mental health trauma specialist. So, yeah.
So what got you interested in psychedelic therapy?
Well, in my own personal life, I've been using, experimenting, and even at times abusing illicit substances. And there's always a strong calling to them, particularly, things of a more psychedelic nature. And probably in the last 15 years, 20 years or so, I've been, been using them more intentionally for wellness, for, spiritual, for deeper connection with nature. And I think, I've been very focused in being, a participant in some medicine groups that are facilitated by some, very skilled, in-depth facilitators. And then most recently, just, because of that journey and because of that exposure, also been interested in supporting people who have been using or working with psychedelic therapists, structured groups that use psychedelics. And recognizing there's a need for to support people with the integration after those experiences, because there has been the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Was there a personal experience in your journey that stood out as particularly transformative or healing?
Yeah, let's start with the ugly. So, I'm imagining it was about 15 years ago, I, through a colleague and a friend, was introduced to a quote-unquote shaman who was using medicine yopo as part of his treatments. And so I was very curious at that time, because I had never done anything formal or facilitated by a medicine person or a shaman or a psychedelic therapist. And so I was very curious, and I've been doing a lot of therapy over my life. I had a lot of trauma and a lot of intense experiences through my life. And so I was really curious about this as not just an experience, but also the healing potential around that. And so I went in with some naivete and some curiosity. And it was a very, very intense learning experience. So the Yopo experience is sort of delivered through a snuff. And that experience opened up all kinds of, I don't want to call them doorways, and I'm actually going to take away the term opened up. It unlocked many layers of armor, trauma, character structure, like just blew open so many things that I had learned to control, manage, contain, to survive. And I had, incessant waves of extreme fear, anxiety, rage, deep grieving, then flipping into levity and laughter, and then periods of stillness. So those waves went on for several hours of intensity. And, if you were watching it, for those of you who are aged enough, if you ever watched the movie The Exorcist, it would have looked something like that, going on for about 6 hours. Now, some people would say, "No, why in the heck would you put yourself through that experience?" And if I knew that was what was going to happen, I wouldn't have. However, what it did do is it did reveal to me all these things that were hidden to myself. And this was even after many, many years and thousands of dollars of traditional psychotherapy to attend to a lot of my attachment wounds and trauma and all those kinds of things. So even though I've learned since then that the process to get to that state can be much more gentler and contained, that experience was one that just really showed me, oh my gosh, like what I'm actually holding and containing, which was very much cut off from myself on a conscious level. So it was transformative in that. And being a slow learner, I had to go back 2 more times and do 2 more sessions with this person. And the second session was maybe not as intense, and the third one was very intense. But again, they were all very revealing to me of patterns, my mommy issues, my daddy issues, my triggers. All of these things showed up in the session under the medicine and with this particular individual. The one thing I will say about that is, in Western mind, and from a trauma-informed perspective, I would say that process of not knowing the person beforehand, not developing relationship, not having a safe relational container, not doing preparation other than maybe some dietary things, I wouldn't do that, from a trauma-informed perspective. Human nervous system likes gentle in and gentle out for things to be integrative. I refer to this person as the still face shaman because during the session, there's very little eye contact, very little engagement. I was, calling for help at times, and he was very reluctant to deal with me directly. He was just sort of in his world doing the shaman thing. And so in many ways, I was left on my own to manage all my disturbance. So from a modern trauma-informed psychological perspective, I'd say that's a big no-no. You want to have a nice, safe relational container. You want to have that connection. And yet, from a shamanistic perspective, I don't know. Maybe that's exactly what I needed to crack open my shell. So I'm sort of holding the paradox of both ways of looking at it. So that would be sort of the ugly. And maybe I'll just share one of the more positive ones, which is just a huge heart-opening experience on a combination of 2CB and MDMA. And that was during a personal psychedelic therapy session I had for myself with two facilitators or two therapists working on me. And that was built with a lot of preparation, a lot of safety, a lot of getting to know the people I was working with, really supporting the set and the setting, as well as the medicine. These are the three main factors around, psychedelic therapy is, each one of those realms of my internal psychological state, the setting that I'm actually doing the treatment in, and then the medicine, those are equally impactful in terms of the outcomes. And so with that, I was able to bring up old traumas, but have a different response. And that's really how trauma gets transformed is, having a bit of an activation, but not going down the same old rabbit hole, the same pattern. And because my nervous system was flooded with, dopamine and oxytocin and serotonin, I could feel the emergence of the discomfort of the trauma. But because I had all these pleasurable sensations and my heart was wide open, I could have a new experience to process those events and have a different behavioral, emotional, psychological repertoire from that experience. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, that sounds wonderful. And, I had very similar kind of experiences with psychedelics in my 20s, that kind of egg cracking, which is very uncomfortable. And to be honest, on some level, I've been kind of reluctant to kind of go there again because it was so shocking and at least at that time really lacked the healing context that you talk about. So it seems with psychedelic therapy, there is this real evolution, not necessarily around the drugs, but more around the context in which those drugs are being taken.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just refer back to, the setting, and the medicine, right? And the set is to, it's a very important intake process that happens to basically get a sense of, is this the right thing for you at this time? Based on your history and your current circumstances, looking at your current support systems, your current levels of physical and emotional health, your ability to have social connections or supports, all kinds of things that basically say, are you stable and grounded enough to have things open up to you in maybe a way that can be very surprising for you and revealing for you. And so for some people, it's not the right thing. And to create that relational environment, which is the safety, so people can relax, that helps them create that internal set that's going to be, safe and supportive, that even if things become difficult, that they're going to be supported through that. Oftentimes people go into distress when they either perceive or they are really in it alone. That's the distressing piece about human beings. We're not actually meant to do life alone. We're so interconnected in terms of how our nervous system is wired to co-regulate with other human beings. And so when you have that supportive environment, that is such a powerful support in addition to the medicine and in addition to the setting.
So I think it'd be interesting to kind of look at just the evolution of this as a therapy going way back. It started out as in terms of human evolution from the kind of shamanic perspective, and then the 50s and 60s was studied pretty intensively, and then just nothing. We went into kind of prohibition. Do you want to talk a little bit about the evolution of the use of psychedelics?
Yeah, I mean, as you're saying, in the 50s and 60s, these were researched and studied and used quite extensively with a lot of very positive sort of anecdotal, subjective reports of that. There was not a lot, or there wasn't a huge amount of sort of, qualitative or sort of quantitative research in terms of clinical trials, but it was very much emerging. And then through that, then there was a sort of social consciousness expansion that happened within the 60s. And so it was really changing how people were looking. I'll talk primarily around North America, maybe specifically about the US, around the consciousness, around politics, around the Vietnam War, around civil rights. All those things it's like, pardon the pun, mushrooming of consciousness, of people really shifting paradigms, looking past the veils to seeing the injustices, the deceit, the lies, all of those things. But on a personal level or a transpersonal level, these were very positive and freeing experiences for individuals, but very threatening for systems of control and power. And then, we had this sort of war on drugs that just all of a sudden, this whole field of investigation and use therapeutically had to go underground. And it's been sort of simmering and bubbling and sort of staying alive for a few decades before we've had this reemergence. I'd say probably at least the last 15 to 20 years, it's sort of been coming more and more. And then in the last couple of years, it's very mainstream now. Like, you shared a link with me last week about, some articles on the CBC. I mean, it's in mainstream media now. Clinical studies are happening all across North America, Canada. I mean, places like in the Netherlands, psychedelic therapy has been legal. They have clinics there. So it's really, again, coming back into the consciousness is something that's more mainstream.
On an experiential level, is there a difference between plant medicines and synthetics?
Well, if you look at the sort of chemical composition, they have some similarities, but you have to also remember there's context, that set and setting, which has equal impact as well as the medicines. So when you look at traditional sort of plant medicines, you can think of things like ayahuasca, washuma, psilocybin, iboga, like these came from a particular geographical place in a particular time, in a particular culture with a particular way of social orientation of people living in more traditional, integrated, helpful societies, right? And so that these people and these cultural practices evolved with the plants and the land and the geography. So that has a very long history. And so the context of that use, I mean, in many ways, if we look at things like ayahuasca or other traditional uses, was not so much about healing problems for the individual. It was more about stabilizing or healing the community, the clan, the tribe, right? But because Western mind is very much, I am the center of the universe, the individual versus the we, we have a different sort of orientation towards using these kinds of things. There's been this huge sort of ayahuasca tourism, people from Western countries, going to South America and, having an experience. But, some people have amazing transformative experiences and some people have very terrible experiences because they're walking without preparation, without connection, without community into a completely different culture. Like just for some people, culture shock without medicine can be overwhelming. So they have all of this, and then they go into an extremely intense experience in a completely foreign place and culture. And that can tip people over the edge from having a good experience to a negative experience. But back to your question, I mean, the synthesized psychedelics like LSD, 2CB, MDMA, those kinds of things, they're all sort of working on the same systems, just in different ways. Different formulations, whether it's on, infusing people with massive doses of serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, and oxytocin. Those are the four main sort of neurotransmitter hormones that create these subjective states for the different medicines, whether they're traditional plant medicines or synthetics.
So I'll be sure to post links in the show notes to the different trials that are happening here in Canada, and two of them on the island, on Vancouver Island. One is working with ketamine, and the other one is, I think, focused with psilocybin. The results of these trials are I would describe as incredible. are almost unbelievable, where people with intractable mental health challenges like addictions or PTSD, anxiety, depression are described being cured after, really only a handful of sessions. What is happening in the brain? Do you think that can account for those kind of remarkable transformations?
Yeah, before I mention that, I just want to talk a little bit about the word cure. I don't like that particular word personally. I'm not saying I'm right. I just want to say that. And, at least in the lineage and the training that I've done, the main benefit of using psychedelic therapy is not so much in the treatment day itself, as powerful as that is, but it's in the integration afterwards. So, and the reason that that's the case is that if we were cured after a couple of sessions, we wouldn't need to do integration. So then we have to say, okay, the treatment day gives you an opportunity for more choice, for a different way of thinking, feeling, acting, and that the integration is then creating a structure, a routine, a change of how you think, a change of your behavior to basically maintain the new neural pathway that we're growing that the psychedelics offers us. So, for example, with psilocybin, in terms of its general sort of impact, it has two things. So number one is it sort of slows down and dysregulates old brain patterns, which are mostly sort of focused on individual and specific. So it sort of like slows those down and arrests them. And it creates the opportunity for new neural pathways that are more global, more transpersonal, more integrative. Okay, so more or less changes the channel of consciousness away from the me into connections with nature and spirit and other human beings, and gives these positive qualities towards them of reverence, of beauty, of appreciation, of, dare I say, love, right? So it allows these new sort of neural pathways to happen, and these new feelings, these new subjective experiences come from this massive sort of dose of serotonin and dopamine that also come. So the old neural pathways of thinking, feeling, behaving, they get sort of put to sleep a little bit. And then we get these wonderful sort of felt senses with a new perspective of how we can see ourselves in a greater context in life. And this is one of the things that I was saying earlier about how relationships are so important for human beingness. Like we're wired for relationship. Like that's our primary purpose, no matter what your prefrontal cortex monkey mind says. Okay, like there's way more neurons in the ventral vagal part of our nervous system, which is the mammal part, right? Which is the part that we use to engage and pick up mammal cues from other human beings, even though my little prefrontal cortex is blah, blah, blahing to you right now. Even though we're doing this on a virtual platform, what's happening is, because I will get a voice tone from you and I can see some body language from you, Silas, on the screen, that's enough of those unconscious mammal cues that will stimulate my ventral vagal. And then after a while, when I'm picking up these unconscious mammal cues, if we're in person, by the way, I'd be picking up your scent, your pheromones. I'd be noticing the tone of your skin, just telling me how fast your heart's beating, and the size of your pupil. So all of these things are basically telling me, are you happy? Are you sad? Are you dangerous? Are you safe? Like communicating to me at a distance to basically say, can I approach? So ventral vagal lights up. And then after a while, if I keep interacting with you, and you're in a good place, you have sufficient levels of serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, and oxytocin flowing through your nervous system, these things called mirror neurons will start activating in my ventral vagal, and they'll create a neurochemistry in response to you. So you can literally dose me with serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, oxytocin if we start relating together. Or you can trigger me into adrenaline cortisol if you're in hyperarousal stress response, or you can trigger me into hypoarousal if that's where I go, which is I'm going to shut down and not produce enough neurochemistry. That's that freeze response. So all that to say that the relationships piece really is so critical and so important in terms of the neurochemistry functions, right? So we look at some of these plant medicines, these psychedelics, they give us these felt senses of what we're missing in life because we live such oftentimes isolated, disintegrated, individualist, competitive lifestyles, which is what our modern Western industrial culture creates for us, right? It's not about collaboration and cooperation and supporting each other, right? So we are living in an unhealthy context so to have this mindset that generally speaking, there's always exceptions, right? But generally speaking, to live in this modern world, to have an expectation that you should be healthy and well is sort of, and I use this word, in the right way, is sort of crazy.
And if I follow your train of thought, it's like we can't really be fully cured as long as our culture is in this kind of chronic degraded state.
Exactly. And, I do a lot of trainings for large organizations. And one of the most common ones is talking about the epidemic that we have in our culture on mental illness and how to, quote unquote, manage that in the workplace. And we don't talk about it, that we are living in an epidemic of mental health disorders in our culture, right? This has been going on for quite some time. We're getting better. There's a lot of stigma that doesn't want us to actually acknowledge the elephant in the room or address it or give the resources and mindset to it. Because if we actually did that fully, we'd have to deconstruct all the things that actually create these states of dis-ease, which is hugely our culture. So, so this is one of the challenges that we have around that, that as you're saying, like, if you're living in a toxic environment, what's the best outcome you could expect from somebody? And here we find ourselves in the world of harm reduction, that now is sort of like a noble end game, which is really unfortunate and yet somewhat accurate.
So let's talk a little bit about the context. We mentioned this earlier, and you've had some experiences in a therapeutic session. What made it safe for you?
Well, several things. Number one was, me having an intrinsic desire. So giving consent to myself first. Consent's so important in the whole process, but we sometimes forget to check in with myself. Am I actually giving myself real consent? Or am I going into old patterns of people pleasing, pushing, going to extreme experiences, like really checking in? And I was like, no, this is something I'm really curious about. And then number two, the way the whole protocol and was set up is, we took time to get to know my two co-therapists. And to, talk about risks, to talk about things like, do I have any triggers that they should be aware of in terms of music or scent or touch or whatever that may be. So we're just spending that time creating that safe relational container of trust, right? The environment was in just a spectacularly beautiful environment, just surrounded by nature. And even without psychedelics, like for me, and I think for most human beings, if they could get out of some of their programming about, nature is dangerous and icky and dirty and all these things, like when you drop into those deeper places, it's such profound medicine, just being in a natural system, right? Especially if you're fortunate like we are. So I was to live, in a beautiful place that actually has some intact, pristine ecosystems available, like this sort of vestige of what sanity is in terms of a construct of how to see life versus, living in cities. And, I live in a city, I live in a beautiful city, but it's still a city.
Yeah, some of the most healing experiences I've had on retreat actually were, just north of here in Shawnigan Lake. For about 10 years, my spiritual community would have a winter retreat, and just being immersed in that environment and being with people during a holiday, which is usually not the best time for a lot of people, was just so much was accomplished in silence, actually.
So again, we talk about creating that setting, relational setting, physical environment, the actual treatment room, being comfortable, pillows, blankets, like just really the attention. And then having two healthy, grounded, qualified people being fully present to me for an extended period of time for several hours. Like who gets that unless you're a baby with some awesome parents? Like what adults actually get that kind of attunement and presence and attention? And again, reminding us that as human beings, we're wired for relationship. This is potent medicine. Like I can, do psychedelics in a closet and I can have certain experiences, but that's an isolated thing. It has to then be integrated into the nature of who I am, which is primarily a relational animal. So how do I bring that out into my day-to-day living with other people, right?
What happens if things start to go off the rails and someone has a bad trip?
The thing around, the bad trip or being uncomfortable, like when we're using this in a therapeutic setting, like if we're dealing with trauma, trauma is oftentimes stored in the body. And we're holding, I told you about my experience about locking down and putting on all the armor instead of being able to move it out and through and transform that energy and sort of, compost it for new growth. And trauma can be quite transformative and growthful if we have the support and healing around that, or it can be very debilitating. So it can go either way. It can bring up huge growth, or it can keep people in very debilitated states. So that the discomfort is like, we actually do want it to come up, the affect, the energy, however it's being held in the body. But we just want to stop people from going into the fear-mongering, amplifying stories that create more and more distress. Like if I feel like, oh my God, my heart's starting to race and my chest is starting to tighten in, and then I start going into a story, or I start thinking, oh my God, I'm not going to be able to breathe, and something bad's going to happen. And then it's like throwing a can of gasoline on a little flame that would typically burn out, and, thinking we're going to put it out. So that's where the container, the therapist can gently guide and support the person to stay with the process, to watch it move and change, and to engage with it in a different way. That's the building of the new neural pathway for them to continue the integration work after.
Yeah, let's talk a bit about the integration. Again, looking back to my experiences in my 20s, particularly with mushrooms, I'd have these very profound experiences. And there was this one time I was downtown with some friends, and I knew I had to write stuff down. So we went into a pizza shop and had some really greasy pizza late at night. And when I woke up in the morning, I looked at the napkin and wrote stuff down on it. It was complete gibberish. What's the process of sense making after a session?
Well, one of the things that the sitters or psychedelic therapists do during a treatment session is we try to minimize the amount of verbal content in the session to encourage people to stay in their body, in their feelings. But, there might be an awareness that comes up and they may want to remember that. So we encourage them to speak it out loud, like, oh yeah, daddy issues around guilt and shame. And then someone will record that with the time, so we'll have more of a coherent sort of document for that person to reflect back on, so that they can then, in the integration, start creating routines and structures and habits in their life that will support the new neural pathways that are shaping and forming to then make them the dominant muscle, the unconscious software that then takes over.
As a clinician, do you distinguish between a spiritual experience and what might be called as a biochemical brain chemistry issue or problem?
For me, they're just parallel experiences. So if I'm having a physiological neurochemical experience, I'm also having an emotional experience, and I'm also having a cognitive intellectual experience, and I'm also having a spiritual experience, whether I identify it as such or not. So the human nervous system is this full spectrum, integrative, holistic organism. But, my little left brain scientific mind can't understand something so big and unfathomable in its wholeness that I have to, break it into little chunks and then into smaller chunks and put names and labels on it and then call it something so I can understand it. But then I forget to actually put it back into the holistic thing when I apply it. So all to say, I work, if I'm working with people, it's like if they want to work on a psychological level because that's where their mind goes, then that's what we do. I'll call it whatever it is, but I know it's going to have impacts on all realms. So, for example, some of the clinical trials and the uses of psilocybin has been to help and support people who have terminal illness diagnoses, to help them deal with their anxiety. So how does something like psilocybin do that? Well, number one is it gives them a different perspective, that this less than the me, this lone little thing in the universe, to something that's actually connected to all life, to all plants, to nature, to people, to the cosmos, and then all of a sudden we don't feel so alone and isolated. But if my little narrow sort of mindset of this is my life, this is all it is, and it's very, very just this small, and now it's going to end, well, we can understand why people would be freaking out. We live in a death-phobic culture. We try to avoid death, even getting older, right? Like, so many people, who should be elders are acting and dressing like still wanting to be young, virile teenagers or in their early 20s. Like they're just pushing away death. And then all of a sudden, this may come up to them, this reality, maybe more than earlier than they thought. And they weren't prepared for it because our culture doesn't support us to actually acknowledge the life-death cycle of the nature of things.
Yeah, so we're kind of going full circle back to the culture piece. Mm-hmm. And I do feel that we live in a very death-phobic culture, which is, materialism. Where do you see psychedelic therapy going in the next 5 to 10 years, and how will that affect the culture of medicine, but also our wider society?
It's so hard to predict because embedded in this beautiful possibility for personal, interpersonal, transpersonal, cultural, spiritual healing and evolution, it's embedded in all these sort of constructs of power, economics, politics, all of that. And those are the wild cards. Mm-hmm. So I really don't know what it's going to look like. Right now, the trajectory, at least in Canada, seems very progressive and very liberal and also responsible. They're taking their time and they're doing small little studies and, and building up the evidence and giving, the culture and everyone time to get used to this change. That's what I'm saying about, the human nervous system needs gentle transitions in and out. Well, groups of people and culture and everything. We don't like things that are too quick or too intense. That's the loose definition of trauma. So even if it's a good thing, we do want to go slowly and responsibly. And because there's been so much propaganda and stigma about the use of quote unquote illicit substances or certain types of medicines, people have a lot of fear about that. And they have a lot of judgments, and it brings up this pushback. And people who like to take advantage of people's fears can use that politically. If we got in a different type of government, Health Canada might have a very different perspective mandated from politicians about giving licenses or permission or exemptions for people to use these medicines to help people get well. Mm-hmm. My sense is, and I don't know, I don't know what it will actually look like in terms of impact, but I think if anything, it will likely be more medicalized, because generally speaking, there's a fair amount of trust with the medical system and physicians. So that I could see would be something that could counterbalance people's like, oh, drugs and psychedelics and all of this weird stuff, right? If the doctors are on board with that, then people will be a little bit more believable than maybe, some intellectuals or some, people who don't sort of fit the Johnny sort of straight lace kind of look, right? However, then if things do become medicalized, then it might restrict a whole bunch of gifted practitioners who, don't have a medical background. People who have been doing the work, have been holding this work over these last decades and really pioneering. So, because then we're going to get maybe some politics involved with maybe medical associations wanting to control everything. And so, it's a wild west right now, as far as I know.
Yeah, and that's the dilemma, is that Western medicine, for all its wonders, is really a reductionist system. And I can see a conflict brewing because of the holistic vision behind using psychedelics and healing. What would you recommend for, I'm sure there's a lot of therapists tuning in. How should they prepare for this revolution?
Well, I think they should learn a lot about psychedelic therapy, and particularly around the integration piece, because, what sort of drew me into this more on a professional level was in the last few years, just noticing a lot of clients who were sort of coming to me, needing some support after having a psychedelic experience, whether if it was an individual session or if it was in a group session, like an ayahuasca ceremony or something like that, where they weren't able to make healthy, transformative sense out of the experience. And maybe we're re-traumatized, or we're maybe harmed, or maybe feeling very ungrounded. And they needed somebody to sort of work with that experience to then make sense of it in their day-to-day sort of lives, where we have a family, a job, and those kinds of more mundane things after you've been sort of speaking to the gods or having very sort of big experiences. It's like, oh, now I got to go home and do the dishes, and I don't know if I can do that anymore, right? So just helping people integrate the big eagle view back into the mouse steps.
Well, this has been a very inspiring conversation, Jim. Thank you so much. How can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, they can find me on Google. My last name's a little interesting, but I do have a website called Medicine Moves that's plural, medicinemoves.ca. It's probably the easiest way to take a look at my website and go down the rabbit holes there.
I want to say thanks again to Jim for this great conversation. And if you want to learn more about his work, you can head over to medicinemoves.ca, and I'll be sure to post that link, as well as other links in regards to clinical trials, happening here in Canada, and other resources around psychedelic therapy at awakenrelationship.com. While you're there, don't forget to sign up for the newsletter. Also, if you found some value in this episode, I really appreciate you taking the time to go to Apple or Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts, really, and please leave a review. It really helps me to grow the podcast, so thank you, and till next time, stay connected.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Awake in Relationship. If you liked what you heard, please click subscribe to get the latest show delivered fresh to your device, or sign up for our newsletter at awakeinrelationship.com. Sharing is caring.